Hey there folks, the number one Mdou Moctar fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Mdou Moctar record, Tears of Injustice. Mdou Moctar have made a name for themselves in recent years as one of the premier, most beloved exports of music coming out of not just their home country of Niger, but the entire continent of Africa, generally speaking. I mean, coming straight out of Niger, records like 2021's Afrique Victime kind of put the group and their namesake frontman slash guitarist in the spotlight in a way that very few African rock bands have achieved over the course of history. Many different notable African rock bands being pretty much relegated to their home country or their home continent, depending on how popular they were. It's really cool to see a band like Mdou Moctar really manage to branch out and take their political stances on a larger stage, on a larger scale. It's really nice to see, especially when the music is as good as it is. Their guitar-heavy style of music has maintained a pretty immense sense of popularity, considering their own brand is kind of out of style, musically speaking, as far as the mainstream goes, and that's a sentiment that they further emphasized with their 2024 record, Funeral for Justice, one of their most politically charged releases to date, and also a pretty strong album overall. While it didn't blow me away, and I don't think it ranks among their best work or anything like that, it's a really good record that I highly recommend nonetheless, and as a whole, the aforementioned record just kind of saw the group keep up with the standards that they had set for themselves on previous records, while not necessarily doing anything terribly new. And now here we are with Tears of Injustice, a re-recording of their previous record, Funeral for Justice, an album that takes Funeral for Justice and kind of brings it into a more acoustic-leaning experience, which is not only a bit of a surprise, but ultimately it manages to highlight some of the best qualities of that record quite well, and allows them to go in a new direction stylistically. Tears of Injustice allows Mdou Moctar to kind of take themselves in a new direction creatively, and I think that's arguably the one single undeniable thing about this record. Even if you don't enjoy this album, you can't really deny that it's something new for them. I mean, the acoustic focused on their latest effort is something relatively new for them, at the very least. I mean, they have certainly toyed with the idea of acoustic segments and passages and more stripped back tracks on previous records. That is not something I am denying whatsoever, but it's been quite some time since they've really dedicated an extended portion of a record to that sort of sound, and it arguably is more present here than it's ever been on any of their past music. I certainly don't think they've ever put out an album that feels this raw and unfiltered, and that's saying a lot considering even their more massive or flush music definitely sounds pretty raw in and of itself, but nonetheless, one of the biggest issues with the band's efforts in recent years being that it rarely feels like they are pushing themselves sonically in any way. It feels hard to deny that they are finally taking themselves in a new direction. And while this obviously is just a brief detour before they get to their next studio album, as most re-recordings of records really tend to be, let's be honest here, I nonetheless think it's really nice to hear from them. I mean, Tears of Injustice feels undeniably fresh, and overall, it's a pretty exciting direction for Mdou Moctar to go in, however briefly that they may go into it. I mean, it's something relatively unsurprising, especially when you consider that this is a basically stripped-down version of a sound and a record that we've already heard before, and that they've already been executing well for a while at a very consistent rate, but nonetheless, it's nice to see them pull off a sound that's ever so slightly different from what you're used to from them, without them completely betraying their roots in their own regional rock music kind of subgenres. I think it's really nice to see them kind of switch things up without being too different that they feel unrecognizable. The folksy nature of Tears of Injustice also kind of lends a surprising hand to highlighting the more political nature of the original record, something that I never really see people talk about, both in the context of that album and in the context of the band as a whole, when honestly, they are an extremely political band. I mean, while Mdou Moctar have never really shied away from expressing their political activism, especially after a still semi-recent, as far as I'm aware, political coup in their own home country of Niger, an event that I'm sure has left them continuously burnt and more socially aware and conscious than ever before, it's really nice to hear their confident and admirable political stances and activism in the more bare-bones versions of songs like Modern Slaves and the title track, that allow for those stances to shine through that much more. It really does allow them to feel like the most unfiltered versions of not just themselves as musicians, but themselves as people, and that makes this kind of a fascinating listen. I mean, they've always been a very personable band on a musical level, not trying to blind you with fierce technicality or overproduction, but at the same time, really taking it to the most instrumentally simplistic level while never letting go of that instrumental ability and highlighting that political sound and lyrical style. It's something that works immensely here. And while, like I said before, I am kind of surprised that people don't really talk about Mdou Moctar's politics as much as I think the band kind of implied that they expect via their music and their lyricism, I also kind of understand it. I mean, when you are being blasted with the instrumental ability and the earnest appreciation for the heavier side of early psychedelic music that Mdou Moctar so consistently deliver across their music, across their discography, it can be easy to forget just how impassioned the group is about justice for marginalized people. I mean, Tears for Injustice never fails to let the listener remember that Mdou Moctar is indeed a political band, and it serves them well. It's a pleasant reminder that they will continue to refuse to back down for oppressive governments, for political opposition, the kind of things that just seemingly don't bother them at all, and I have nothing but pure admiration for them from that standpoint, and I think it really does shine through here and elevates this record and makes it feel like something that we've maybe never quite heard before from Mdou Moctar, not in the literal sense, but in terms of how it's presented, and I think that makes for not just an interesting record, but also a deeply engaging one. Now, unfortunately, while I would like to keep kind of just lobbing praise at this record, because it does deserve it, I also kind of can't help but feel like Tears of Injustice is sort of a pretty heavy reminder of why Mdou Moctar were so intense in the first place. It's the instrumentals. They've always been a pretty heavy band, generally speaking, and when you strip that away, you kind of take away a little bit of what made them such an engaging band in the first place. I mean, one of the biggest issues that I personally had with Funeral for Justice was that it was a good record, it was musically really easy to get into, but at the same time, it just kind of felt like nothing particularly new compared to previous records from the group. And now this reinvented version of that album kind of has the positives and the negatives sort of just like swapped around, so to speak. I mean, on one hand, the increased highlight of the activistic nature of this record is really nice and something that I do feel is a bit lost in the mix on the original album, and I really like how personal this record feels. I like how it takes things in a new direction for the band, but, you know, at the same time, despite this feeling like a refreshed yet equally raw Mdou Moctar, it also feels like a significantly less interesting or distinct version of themselves, with a lot of tracks kind of just blending together here in my eyes. I mean, the songs are still really great, the band still sounds as tight as ever, even in this new musical context, but there just feels like there's a lot less to latch onto here when everything is put into acoustic form. You know, and in a sense, I think that's interesting, you know, because it means that this is sort of an equal to the original version of this record, while at the same time really having none of its better qualities or worse qualities in common with that original record. I feel like a lot of re-recordings of albums are either one of two things. Either one, it's completely unnecessary and just a worse version of an album that didn't need to be re-recorded, or two, a record that is pretty much equal with the original album because the band or artist doing so, it, you know, just never really lost their touch, and at the same time, most of those records feel pretty unimportant too, so I mean, you know, but I digress. And in this sense, it kind of feels like these two records are sort of equals, despite not really having any of their highlights or lowlights in common whatsoever, their better qualities and worse qualities, because I really do feel like most of the time, re-recorded records that come even just a year or two after the original recording just kind of serve one of two purposes. Either one, they have no purpose, and generally speaking, they are just worse versions of albums that didn't need to be remade and stories that did not need to be retold, or two, it ends up being a record that is just as fine as the original because it doesn't sound that different. Maybe some production tweaks are made, but at the end of the day, it's pretty much the same record that you know and love, and there's no real point in going to both when one is probably just a slight preference for you. Here, it's kind of interesting, a bit of a rarity for me. It's quite literally a flip-flop of what I like about these albums, and in that sense, whether that was intentional or not, in the manner manner in which Mdou Moctar presented this record in comparison to Funeral for Justice, I do think it kind of makes me want to go back to both when I'm in the mood for them. I mean, don't get me wrong, I just have other, like, Mdou Moctar records that I would go to first, but if I ever specifically sat down and said, man, I want to listen to Funeral for Justice today, I would have to think, do I want to listen to Funeral for Justice, or do I want to listen to Tears of Injustice? You know, which one am I in the mood for? Both are equally good, both have their strengths and weaknesses, and as a whole, I think that even if this does kind of do away with some weaker qualities of the original album, while also forgetting some of the great things about the original record, I also think that it makes for a unique listening experience, and it really doesn't feel like the detour that it pretty objectively is in terms of, you know, re-recording music. I don't think it matters what artist is doing it, it always is a detour in one way or another, but I digress. I think it makes for an interesting album that differentiates itself from the original record enough that it warrants its own existence, and that's something that I rarely say about re-recorded albums. Look, I'll be totally upfront. If you came into Mdou Moctar because you really loved their burning guitar work and their really locked-in rhythm sections, you might not love Tears of Injustice as much as their previous work, even though I'm sure you'll probably still enjoy it, because that guitar work and that steady rhythm is still definitely here, just in a different form. And there's plenty to love about this album. I mean, Funeral for Justice's political awareness is highlighted tenfold here when compared to the original record, and it would be hard not to appreciate, or at the very least respect, the fact that the band takes time to ensure that the entire record here just feels worthwhile, worth your time, whether you're an Mdou Moctar fan already, or you are entirely inexperienced with their work up to this point. And that isn't to mention the simple pleasantness of just hearing them go for a different sound from what most fans would probably expect from them at this point. Tears of Injustice is far from the band's magnum opus, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, it's a strong release, and it's a rare example of an acoustic reworking of a recording that actually, like, feels warranted and feels like it has purpose. You know, that's a rarity, trust me. There are plenty of god-awful acoustic records out there, of records that were not originally acoustic. And you know what? The fact that this album can pull that off and actually not feel like a waste of time, it deserves like 5 stars off of that already, but no, I'm not that easy. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this album review. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.